Bismillah walhamdulillah wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah. So this is the second sitting, reading through al-Usool, Min Ilm, al-Usool. And today's sitting, inshallah ta'ala, we're going to look at the portion of the book where the author, rahimahullaah, spoke about Ahkam, or rulings. And there's going to be a couple of things. He's going to speak about rulings in general. What does it mean? Then he's going to talk about the different types of ruling, the two types that he's going to mention. And then for them, he's going to mention 7 rulings together. And for each of the rulings, he's going to discuss 2 or 3 points each, inshallah ta'ala. So the author began by mentioning al-Ahkam. And he has here the first point here, al-Ahkam. Okay, what does it mean? Jam'u hukmin. It is the plural of the word hukm. And linguistically, or in the language, it is called في اللغة, in the lugha, وهو لغة القضاء. It is a judgment. واصطلاحا, and as a terminology, it is, and now if you in your book put this between brackets or highlight it, this is the terminology of the word hukm or ahkam. What does it mean Islamically in usul fiqh? It is this terminology here. ما قتضاه خطاب الشرع, that which the khitab of the shar', that which is necessitated or entailed by the divine speech or the legislative speech or legislative address. Al-muta'allaq, which is connected to af'al, the actions, al-mukallifin, of those who have a responsibility, min talabin, and this which is necessitated from the legislative address can either be talab, is from requests, talab, or takhir, or choice, or wada', or something that has been put in place, So when we say what is a hukm, or what are ahkam, they are those things which the legislative address mandate or necessitate. Which legislative address? The legislative address which is connected to the actions of the responsible beings. And those can either be from requests or choices or indication of things which have been put in place. And the Shaykh, as is his aada, is going to elucidate this definition. So he's going to mention here, like he done for the title Usul Fiqh and Fiqh, he mentions here. So فَالْمُرَادُ بِقَوْلِنَا, what we intend when we say khitab al-shar', when we say khitab al-shar' here in the definition, then what we intend by this is al-kitab wa sunnah. So the legislative address, i.e. the Quran or the Sunnah. وَالْمُرَادُ بِقَوْلِنَا, so that's one point. Second point, وَالْمُرَادُ بِقَوْلِنَا الْمُتَعَلَّقُ بِأَفْعَالِ الْمُكَلِّفِينَ, that which is connected to the actions of the mukallifin or the mukallafin, the mukallaf, those who have a responsibility has been placed upon them. ما تعلق بأعمالهم سواء كانت قولا أم فعلا إيجادا أم تركا, i.e. those things which are connected to the actions. They're connected to the a'mal, whether they be statements or physical actions, includes both statements and physical actions, and whether it be those things which they have been told to do, to bring about, or to leave, to tark, ijadan am tarkan. And he says, so this excludes for us, i.e. this statement here from the definition, kharaja bihi, it excludes for us, or due to it, the following exemptions are made, or things are excluded from what a hukm is in our definition. Remember, we're talking about istilahan. I hope you can see that on the, so we're talking about istilahan here. So he says فخرج به ما تعلق بالاعتقاد. that which is connected to the beliefs. فلا يسمى حكما بهذا الاصطلاح. It is not regarded or is not mentioned or is not named hukm in this terminology. Remember, we're speaking about a specific terminology, and that is in Usul al-Fiqh and Fiqh, and at times Fiqh. Then the next part of the definition is this word al-mukallafin, those who bear responsibility. He says here, ما من شأنهم التكليف فيشمل الصغار والمجنون الصغير والمجنون. أي المكلفين, those who have responsibility, أي those who in essence from their very being is that they have taklif, they have that responsibility, even though they may not have it at the specific moment. So it includes even the sigar, those that are under age, or those that are majnoon, under this title. Okay, although the sigar and the majnoon, as their essence, as who they are people of taklif, but because they have a mani', they have something that prevents them from bearing that responsibility. But in essence, they are mukallifin. So there's a small side point here that the author is making. So if someone says, who are the people of taklif, he would include the saghir and the majnoon, except that the saghir and the majnoon have a barrier that stops them from taking on that responsibility. And then he carries on with the definition, min talab, from requests. And he says here, al-amru wal-nahyu, whether it be commands, al-amr wal-nahyu, or prohibitions, regardless whether they are ala sabil al-ilzam, whether they are binding, or al-afdaliyah. Binding would be like when something is wajib or haram. So it's a request, it's a command to do something that is binding, that is wajib. Or it's a prohibition to do something, and the prohibition is binding, that would be haram. Or afdaliyah, it is better, that would be the mustahab, and so that would be a command which is not binding, but it is a better option that a person should do, and that would be mustahab. Or there's a prohibition which is not binding, it's from the pattern or from the form of afdaliyah, and that would be makruh. Or takhyir, and this part in the definition, or having a choice, he says here, wal muradu, what we intend by this is al mubah. And then he says, wal muradu bi qawlina, and the next part of the definition, or wad'in, or that ruling is to do with something that has been put in place. And he says here, as-sahih wal-fasid wa nahwihima mimma wada'ahu al-shari'. So as-sahih, the ruling that this is sahih, or the ruling that something is fasid, or that which is similar to them both, from those things that have been put in place by the shari', by the legislator, min alamatin aw awsaf wa awsafin lin-nufudhi wal-ilgha, from the signs and description that something has been completed, has been performed and done properly, or it has been not done properly, has been wasted or gone to ruin. So that's the definition that the author was mentioning with regards to what is a hukm. So he said al-Ahkam is a plural of hukm, and linguistically it is a judgment, and technically, or as a terminology, it is this definition here. And if you want to know anything about this definition here, you look at how the author himself broke it down. Then after he has given us this terminology, then he goes on to mention aqsamul ahkam al-shar'iyyah, the rulings which are Islamic, are of different categories. So the categories of the Islamic rulings, and they are split into two. تنقسم الأحكام الشرعية إلى قسمين. The rulings which are from the Sharia are split into two. قسمين means two categories. تكليفية and وضعية. So put here. Oops. So تكليفية and وضعية. So from the waw. So not the two waws, just this waw here. Wad'iyyah. So Taklifiyyah are those to do with our actions, and Wad'iyyah are those things that have been put in place that don't necessitate our action to bring them into place, but they are indications of something that we may need to do. So he says here, فَالتَّكْلِفِيَّةُ خَمْسَةٌ. So those rulings that come under Taklifiyyah are 5. Number 1, wajib. Number 2, mandub. Number 3, muharram. Number 4, makruh. And number 5, mubah. So those are the 5 rulings al-Taklifiyyah. So sometimes you will hear this al-Ahkam al-Taklifiyyah. So there will be these 5 rulings that are being mentioned. And for each of them, the author is going to tell us what that word means, what it entails, the ruling that it has, and some of the names for it. So now this ruling here, the first one, al-Wajib. So here, I can't even write the number 1, but here if you had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So first one, al-Wajib. Lughatan as-saqit wal-lazim. Something that falls or something which is binding. Wastilahan, technically what it means when the scholars say wajib, ma amara bihi shari', that which the legislator commanded with, ala wajhi al-ilzam. So there are 2 things. There's a command. So if we were to put it on top, it's a command. There's an amr, and the amr is binding. 2 aspects. There's a command and it is binding. كالصلوات الخمس, like the 5 prayers. So he says here, فخرج بقولنا, so with our statement, ما أمر به الشارع, المحرم والمكروه والمباح. So when we say amara, that which has been commanded by the legislator, then automatically we have excluded what? Al-muharram, something that is haram, something that is makruh, or something that is mubah. We haven't excluded what? Al-mandub, because al-mandub is also a command, but it is not binding. So that's what this part of the definition excludes those 3 others. And he says, وَخَرَجَ بِقَوْلِنَا عَلَى وَجْهِ الْإِلْزَامِ, and this part of our definition, that it is binding, this command occurs in a manner that is binding, then this excludes al-mandub, the 4th, well, it's the 2nd in line, but the last of the ones that have been excluded, the last of the 5 rules. So wajib consists of these 2 main points, that it is a command and it is binding. Okay, so that's the definition of what is wajib, linguistically and technically. Then he goes on to mention for us, here, what is the fruit, what is the benefit, or what are the fruits of this, or what is the rule for it? وَالْوَاجِبُ يُثَابُ فَاعِلُهُ امْتِثَالًا. Wajib is that which the person who does it, imtithalan, this is a key point now, the person who does that which is wajib, imtithalan, out of compliance with Allah's command, is rewarded. Yuthab is rewarded. So wajib is that which the person who does it, fa'iluhu, imtithalan, out of compliance with the command, is rewarded. What is out of compliance? So for example, the person may do an action, but he doesn't do it for the sake of Allah. He's not doing it because of the command from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So he is not going to get that reward. So here, imtithala means that the person is doing in compliance with what Allah has commanded. He's not just doing it out of habit or whatever other intention he may have. وَيَسْتَحِقُّ الْعِقَابِ تَارِكُهُ. And the person who leaves it, تَارِكُهُ, يَسْتَحِقُّ, is deserving of iqab, of punishment. And here you'll find scholars talk about different definitions. Some scholars will mention the definition by the fruits. So they say wajib is the one, wajib is that which the doer will get rewarded and the leaver of it will be punished. Now, that's not really a definition of it. That's the fruits of it, or that's the consequence of a wajib, of a person doing a wajib or not doing a wajib. But the scholars, they do that just to make it easier for the beginner. Otherwise, they know what wajib is in terms of a definition. And sometimes you find that they'll say yastahiqu, sometimes they don't say yastahiqu. I.e., yastahiqu mean he is deserving. But it's not necessarily that he will be punished. That's up to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because Allah mentions that He, what translates as that He will forgive that which is less than shirk to whomsoever He wishes. So he may be forgiven. We can't say that he's definitely going to be punished. So you see that some scholars will put these caveats in there to make it more clear. And then, so that was the fruit of the wajib. And then here the author mentions, okay, some of the other names. So number 1, 2, 3, 4. So yusamma, it is also referred to, sometimes you'll see that the word wajib is also used, or other words are used for wajib, fardan, faridah, hatman, laziman, and more than that. So that's all to do with the first point here, wajib. So we had here the definition up to there. Then we had some of the fruits of it or the results of it, and then different names that are used for it. Then the second out of the 5 rules, Taklifiyyah, is number 2 here, al-mandub. Al-mandub. And linguistically, he's going to take the same pattern. The author is going to take the same pattern. Linguistically, al-mad'u. And then technically, he's going to give us the definition, ma amara bihi shari', that which, this is the definition here, that which the legislator has commanded, la ala wajhi al-ilzam. So there's 2 parts again. That which has been commanded, the amr, there's an amr there, there's a command, but la ala wajhi al-ilzam, not in a way or in a manner necessitating or that is binding. Karrawatib, like the prayers that a person does which are connected to the obligatory salahs. The sunnah salahs that a person does which are connected to the obligatory salahs. There's a form of command to them, but it's not something that is binding. So again, the author goes on to explain, فخرج بقولنا ما أمر به الشارع. Okay, when we say amr, that which Allah has commanded, again, this excludes muharram 1, al-makruh 2, and mubah 3. Why does it exclude it? Because the haram, the muharram, and the makruh are prohibitions, not commands. And the mubah, there is no command, no prohibition on it. So straight away, once we know this part of the definition, that is the amr there, we know that these 3 are not part of it. And خرج بقولنا لا على وجه الإلزام, that this command is not in a manner necessitating or making it obligatory, then this excludes for us al-wajib, because wajib is an obligation. The command comes in a way that is obligatory. So that's the definition there, the linguistic and the technical. Then he mentions to us again the fruits of it, or the consequences of doing or not doing this. He says, وَالْمَنْدُوبُ يُثَابُ فَاعِلُهُ امْتِثَالًا. The person who does it, the person who does it in compliance with Allah, i.e. doing it for the sake of Allah, is rewarded. وَلَا يُعَاقَبُ تَارِكُهُ. And the person who leaves it is not punished for that. وَلَا يُعَاقَبُ تَارِكُهُ. The person who leaves it is not punished for that. وَيُسَمَّى سُنَّةً وَمَسْنُونًا وَمُسْتَحَبًّا وَنَفْلًا. And it is called also, this mandub, this name of a hukum, this hukum is also referred to as something which is called sunnah. Sometimes you hear scholars mention that it's sunnah, or they might say it's masnoon, or they might say it's mustahab, and they might say it's naflan. These sometimes are used interchangeably, and sometimes some scholars make a different and distinction between them. So they may refer to something as masnoon or sunnah, and then you wouldn't say that it's mustahab. So that's something that you can pay attention to, and there's not a big issue for us to mention it here, but we just mention it in order to know, to remind us that when we study, even if we study a beginner's book and we finish it, or a intermediate level work, that we have to still keep a certain level of humility because we haven't finished the whole subject. Thirdly, out of the 5 rules, the third one the author mentions, al-muharram, lughatan al-mamnu', it is that which is prohibited. واصطلاحا ما نهي أو ما نهى عنه الشارع, that which Allah, legislator, prohibited, على وجه الإلزام بالترك. So that which it has one aspect is here, that which has been prohibited, and the second aspect, على وجه الإلزام, from the angle or in a way to indicate that it's binding, i.e. the prohibition to leave it is binding. So there's 2 things, there's a prohibition and that prohibition is binding. كعقوق الوالدين, like being undutiful to the parents. فخرج بقولنا, so that's the definition there. Then the author says فخرج بقولنا, so with our statement ما نهى عنه الشارع, that which the legislator prohibited, then this excludes al-wajib, al-mandub and al-mubah, 3 things. Why? Because al-wajib and al-mandub already, as we covered, are not prohibitions, they are commands. Remember that we said amr, they are commands. And al-mubah contains neither a prohibition nor a command. And he says وَخَرَجَ بِقَوْلِنَا, and our statement على وجه الإلزام بالترك المكروه, the fact that the muharram is, and this is the second part of the definition, is in a way, that prohibition is in a way that is binding to leave that thing, then this excludes for us al-makruh, because al-makruh is not binding. So that's the definition. And then he mentions to us the consequences of doing or not doing it. So wal-muharram yuthabu tarikuhu imtithalan. Muharram yuthabu, or let's start from there. Tarikuhu imtithalan, the person who leaves it out of compliance with Allah, with what Allah said, yuthab, will be rewarded. So for example, the person who leaves a sin just because he doesn't want to do it, he never had the thought of doing it, then he doesn't get any reward for just leaving it, because he's not actually even thought about doing it. But the person who leaves the sin off out of compliance with Allah, he is rewarded. And the person who does it, and the person fa'iluhu, the person who does the haram, muharram, is deserving of being punished, i.e. he's under the will of Allah. He is deserving of being punished, so Allah may punish him, or Allah may forgive him. And then he mentions some of the other names for the muharram. It says mahdhuran, something which is mahdhur, or it also can be called as mamnu'an. The fourth definition, or the fourth hukum, al-Taklifi, under the category of al-Taklif, is al-makruh. Al-makruh. And lughatan, in the language, is al-mubghad, that which is disliked or hated. واصطلاحا, linguistically it is ما نهى عنه الشارع لا على وجه الإلزام بالترك, that which the legislator, Allah, has prohibited. That's first part of definition. You can put a little bracket here. لا على وجه الإلزام, not, but its prohibition is not in a way that indicates that it is binding, either the prohibition is binding to leave that thing. Like كالأخذ بالشمال والإعطاء بها, like taking something with the left hand and giving it with the left hand. فخرج بقولنا, so the author rahimahullaah is going to explain now this definition, and we should see a pattern by now. So when he said فما نهى عنه الشارع, that which the legislator prohibited, this excludes al-wajib wal-mandub wal-mubah, because they don't contain this prohibition. Al-wajib wal-mandub both deal with commands. Al-mubah is neither a command nor a prohibition. And then he gives us the second part of the definition, لا على وجه الإلزام بالترك. So when this part of the definition excludes for us al-muharram, because muharram is على وجه الإلزام بالترك. Al-muharram is binding, whereas mandub is not. This la here is very important. Don't get mixed up. لا على وجه الإلزام بالترك. Then he goes on to mention to us al-makruh. والمكروه يثاب فاعله يثاب تاركه امتثالا. Makruh, the person who leaves it, tarikuhu, the person who leaves it for the sake of Allah, imtithaling, following, complying with the prohibition, is rewarded. Yuthab is rewarded. ولا يعاقب فاعله, whereas the person who does it, the fa'il of it, لا يعاقب, is not punished. Number 5, the last of the 5 أحكام التكليفي, المباح لغة المعلن والمأذون به, that which is proclaimed and allowed, that is proclaimed or and allowed. واصطلاحا, and technically it is ما لا يتعلق به أمر ولا نهي لذاته, that which no command, no amr, no nahi are connected with. That which, so mubah is that thing which there is no amr or nahi which are connected to it. Now here, this is the important part, لذاته, in and of itself. In and of itself. Like كالأكل في رمضان ليلا, like eating in the nights of Ramadan. What it means lidhati, i.e. there's something that a person has and there is neither a command nor a prohibition which is connected directly to it. In and of itself. So when it's connected to something else, maybe as a secondary thing, you might say, okay, you might have a ruling that is this or that, but in of itself there is nothing connected to it of command or prohibition. فخرج بقولنا, so the author says here, our statement in the definition, ما لا يتعلق به أمر, al-wajib and mandub, because wajib and mandub have an amr connected to it. وخرج بقولنا النهي ولا النهي المحرم والمكروه. This is excluded when he says ولا النهي ولا نهي, because muharram and the makruh have a nahi. And خرج بقولنا لا لذاته, in and of itself, due to it in and of itself, ما لو تعلق به أمر لكونه وسيلة, ما لو تعلق به أمر, maybe this should be له تعلق به أمر لكونه وسيلة لمأمور. Like for example, a person there may be something which in of itself is neither haram or any of the other rulings in and of itself, but it takes on that ruling because it has a connection to being a wasila, a way to achieve that wajib, or it is a way to achieve a haram, so it takes on the same ruling. أو نهي لكونه وسيلة لمنهي عنه. So it has now, that would take a ruling of that which is connected with. The author then goes on to say, والمباح ما دام على وصف الإباحة فإنه لا يترتب عليه ثواب ولا عقاب. This is the fruits of it. The mubah, as long as the description of ibaha, of it being allowed, is there, فإنه, then it will not take, or it will not have the consequence of it being rewarded or punished. فإنه لا يترتب عليه ثواب ولا عقاب. ويسمى حلالا وجائزا. It is also referred to as halal and jaiz. So that's here the consequence of it, And this is some of the names of it. Okay, we'll go into the Ahkam al-Wad'iyyah. The author rahimahullaah ta'ala has explained to us the Ahkam, the meaning of the word Ahkam, and that Ahkam in Islam are divided into two broad categories: Ahkam Taklifiyyah and Ahkam Wad'iyyah. So now he's going to explain to us, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala, what are the Ahkam al-Wad'iyyah, what is meant by these. So he says here, al-Ahkam al-Wad'iyyah ما وضعه الشارع من أمارات لثبوت أو انتفاء أو نفوذ أو إلغاء. They are that which the Sharia, that which the legislator has put down for us of signs, from signs لثبوت, to establish something, to show us that something is established, or to establish something, or intifa'in, or nufudin, or to show us that something is not established, or to show us that something has been processed, carried out, it is done, or that something has not been done or is wasted. So from these Ahkam Wad'iyyah, we said, which are signs that Allah has put in place to indicate various things to us. From them, he says from them, not all of them, as this is a beginner's book. It says, and he's going to explain both. So first one is الصحيح. فالصحيح لغة السليم من المرض, that which is free from illness. واصطلاحا ما ترتبت آثار فعله عليه عبادة كان أم عقدا, that which ترتبت, established upon it, or let's put it in a different order, that which its actions which are based upon it have brought forth the desired effects. It will be clear, it will become clear with the example. Whether this is connected to ibadah or contracts. So for example, فَالصَّحِيحُ مِنَ الْعِبَادَاتِ, so when it comes to, for example, acts of worship, this would entail two things: مَا بُرِئَتْ بِهِ الذِّمَّةِ, that which frees one's responsibility, وَسَقَطَ بِهِ الطَّلَبِ, and the command or the request from it drops. So two things. So for example, when someone has a ruling upon them that they have to pray, so now they pray, there's another ruling now. His salah, was it sahih or not? Now if the salah was correct, and we say the hukm, the ruling on the salah that he has just performed, the ruling is that it's sahih. Why is it sahih? Because it's fulfilled all the conditions and all the preventative factors were not there and so forth. Okay, so what happens? So his, not guiltiness, but he cannot be described as being guilty now because he's prayed the prayer. If he didn't pray the prayer, or if he prayed it and it wasn't sahih, he would still be guilty of not having prayed the prayer. So his dhimma, his kind of honor, or his status as being innocent is preserved. Buri'at, he's found innocent when his ibadah is sahih. So when we say that ibadah is sahih, it means that ibadah, the person's dhimma has been freed. The person's, you can say, he's not guilty. وَسَقَطَ بِهِ الطَّلَبِ, and the request has dropped now. So once a person has prayed and his salah is sahih, then because it is sahih, that request that was on him to pray is now free. So he's not requested now anymore to pray dhuhr, for example. So the request has now dropped. Why? Because his ibadah, salah, was sahih. So that's sahih in ibadat. So the athar of the action that he done has come into actuality. The athar being that the salah has been prayed. Okay. وَالصَّحِيحُ مِنَ الْعُقُودِ, and the sahih from the contracts, مَا تَرَتَّبَتْ آثَارُهُ عَلَى وُجُودِهِ, is that which its signs or its benefits have come because it is in place. Because it is in place, or because it has come about, i.e. because that contract has come about. What does it mean? كترتب الملك على عقد البيع مثلا. Like for example, when a contract, an aqd, is sahih, then one of the effects of it that is built upon that is that the sovereignship or the ownership of that thing which was purchased, transfers to the person who bought it. So once that contract, the transaction is done, is present, wujud is present, and it is sahih, then the transference of ownership occurs. So this is the author telling us what sahih is. It either is that the effects of that thing come into place. It can be in ibadah or in transactions. From ibadah he gave us two aspects of it, and transaction he gave us one. Then he goes on to say, okay, how do we know if something is sahih, or how does something become sahih? وَلَا يَكُونُ الشَّيْءُ صَحِيحًا إِلَّا بِتَمَامِ شُرُوطِهِ وَانْتِفَاءِ مَوَانِعِهِ. Two things. Something will not be sahih, will not have the hukum of being sahih, except after the conditions have all been met, tamam shurutihi, or the conditions are completed, its conditions are completed, are fulfilled, and the preventative factors are lifted or are removed. And then he gives us an example of that. He says, مثال ذلك في العبادات, an example of that in the acts of worship, أن يأتي بالصلاة في وقتها تامة شروطها وأركانها وواجباتها, is that the person comes and performs the prayer in its time, fulfilling the conditions of the pillars, the arkan, and the wajibat. And an example of that, i.e. of something which fulfills the conditions and removes the preventative factors, an example of that in uqud, so that was ibadat here, an example of that in uqud, أن يعقد بيعا تامة شروطه المعروفة مع انتفاء موانعه, is that the person does a contract of transaction, fulfilling all of the conditions which are known and removing all of the preventative factors. The author says, فَإِن فُقِدَ شَرْطٌ مِنَ الشُّرُوطِ, if a condition from the different conditions is lost, فُقِدَ, is not present, أو وُجِدَ مَانِعٌ مِنْ الْمَوَانِعِ, or a preventative factor from the different preventative factors are found, امتنعت الصحة, صحة will not be achieved. So if a condition is not there, or there's a preventative factor there, then صحة will not be achieved. مثال فقد الشرط في العبادة. So an example of not having a shart in ibadah, أن يصلي بلا طهارة, that the person prays without tahara. So he has lost the condition of purity. So his salah cannot be sahih. ومثال فقد الشرط في العقد, an example of the shart being out from the aqd, is that أن يبيع ما لا يملك, is that he gives, he sells that which he does not own. So this is a condition for the transaction to be correct, that you own that which you're selling. Okay, he doesn't own it, then this will make a problem. ومثال وجود مانع, an example of a mani', a preventative factor being present in the ibadah, أن بنفل مطلق في وقت النهي, that the person prays يتطوع أن يتطوع بنفل مطلق في وقت النهي, with a salah, he prays a salah which is total nafl, is not connected to anything. It's not like the salah of entering the masjid or anything connection like that. So this is a preventive factor that you're not allowed to pray at that time, in the time of not praying. So that salah would not be sahih because there's a preventative factor there. ومثال وجود مانع, وجود المانع في العقد, an example of a mani', a preventative factor being present in a contract, أن يبيع ما تلزمه أن يبيع من تلزمه الجمعة شيئا, that a person who Jum'ah is obligatory for, he sells something. A person who's supposed to be praying Jum'ah, he sells something. بعد ندائها الثاني على وجه لا يباح, after the second call of Jum'ah has come, in a way that is not allowed. So what does it mean? There's a preventative factor here. A person does a transaction at the time when he's not allowed to do a transaction. So for example, he has to pray Jum'ah and the adhan has gone and he's there doing a transaction. In that case, the transaction will not be sahih. Why? Because there's a mani'. The mani' being that he's not allowed to do a transaction at that time, after the second adhan of Jum'ah, and he's somebody that has to pray Jum'ah. So that's sahih. So he mentioned what it is, and that it can occur in ibadah or in transactions. And he gave us some of the consequences of it, and then how it can occur. Basically, it occurs by fulfilling the obligations and fulfilling the shurut and removing any money. Then he goes on to tell us about fasid. He says fasid. Al-fasid لغة الذاهب ضياعا الذاهب ضياعا وخسرا, that which is gone to waste and loss. واصطلاحا ما لا تترتب آثار فعله عليه عبادة كان أو عقدا, that which the effects of that thing will not be found, will not come about, whether it be an act of worship, ibadah, or aqd. فالفاسد من العبادات, so he gives us ibadah example, ما لا تبرأ به الذمة, that which, this is one, put one here, and then the second one, ولا تسقط به الطلب. So this is like the opposite of sahih. ما لا تبرأ به الذمة, that which the person's innocence, his honor is not innocent. So what does that mean? Like for example, a person has to pray Salat al-Dhuhr. He prays it, but not in the correct way. Like it's not sahih. His salah would not be sahih. Like he doesn't have tahara. So now his honor, he is still not free. The person who prayed Dhuhr and he finished Dhuhr and prayed it properly, now he's free. He hasn't got anything on his neck in terms of that prayer. Whereas this person, he prayed, but it was fasid. It was incomplete. So now, one of the effects of it is that it will not now, his effect is not in place. That salah's effect is not in place. His dhimma, his honor is still not innocent. Or and وَلَا يَسْقُطْ, and the request of it has not fallen, i.e. he is still requested to pray. That command for him to pray dhuhr is still in place. Why? Because his salah was not valid. The example the Shaykh gives here, for example, is that the person كَالصَّلَاةِ قَبْلَ وَقْتِهَا, like the prayer before its rightful time. The person prays dhuhr properly, but before the rightful time, then the salah is still requested from him at its rightful time when the time enters. وَالْفَاسِدُ مِنَ الْعُقُودِ, so that's an example from ibadah. Now from the transactions. مَا لَا تَتَرَتَّبُ آثَارُهُ عَلَيْهِ, that which the effects of it are not to be found. أي على العقد كبيع المجهول. Like for example, you try to do a transaction, but the transaction is not done properly. So now the effect, what's normally the effect of a transaction is that there's an exchange of ownership. Now the exchange of ownership will not be there. Why? Because the transaction is fasid. Why is it fasid? We're going to see. For example, the Shaykh gives us an example. It could be fasid because the person is buying something that is unknown. You just buy something which is not known to you. That is not allowed, and the transaction will become fasid. And so the effect of it, ما لا يترتب, the effect will not occur. The effect, the athar, will not occur from that transaction because it is fasid. Then the author rahimahullaah goes on to explain وَكُلُّ فَاسِدٍ مِنَ الْعِبَادَاتِ وَالْعُقُودِ وَالشُّرُوطِ فَإِنَّهُ مُحَرَّمٌ. And everything which is fasid from the ibadat وَالْعُقُودِ وَالشُّرُوطِ فَإِنَّهُ مُحَرَّمٌ لِأَنَّ ذَلِكَ مِنْ تَعَدِّي حُدُودِ اللَّهِ, because that is from transgressing against the rights of Allah. وَاتِّخَاذِ آيَاتِهِ هُزُوًا, and it is a mockery of Allah's signs. ولأن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم أنكر على من اشترط شروطا ليس في كتاب الله, and because the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم rebuked and spoke against whoever makes conditions which are not from the book of Allah. والفاسد والباطل بمعنى واحد. Okay, so that's one point here. Now he's going to mention another point. Fasid and batil are two terminologies that sometimes or most of the time are used with one meaning. بمعنى واحد إلا في موضعين, except in two circumstances. Number one, al-awwal في الإحرام, when it comes to the ihram. The scholars made the distinction between saying that something is fasid and something is batil when it comes to ihram. So if a scholar says that so-and-so's ihram is that the situation was fasid, is that a person done something, like for example he had a relationship whilst in ihram, before doing tahleel of it, before taking it off. That would be considered fasid. When batil would be like someone, he gives the example here, if someone left Islam. Now the scholars then will bring upon that, they will bring different consequences. How does the person fix that? Can it be fixed? Can it not be fixed? The second situation, so just put in your mind, fasid and batil, all you need to do right now here, fasid and batil are often used interchangeably, can be used interchangeably, except in two situations. Number one, when it comes to ihram, like when a person hajj or umrah. And number two, in nikah. The scholars in nikah فرقوا بينهما بين الباطل والفاسد بأن الفاسد ما اختلف العلماء في فساده, is that which the scholars disagreed about the fasad, that marriage being fasid, being incorrect. Like, for example, the person marrying without a wali. Now some scholars say a person is allowed to marry without a wali. Some say no, it's not allowed. Okay, so now they will call that fasid. They wouldn't call it batil, they will call it fasid. Even the scholars that say it's not allowed, they will say that the contract of nikah in that situation is fasid. They wouldn't say it's batil. والباطل and batil ما أجمعوا على بطلانه كنكاح المعتدة. And they will use batil for a marriage contract which all the scholars agree is false. It's not correct. It's not sahih. So those are two differences that the scholars mentioned there. Those are two differences that the scholars mentioned there. Okay, let's go through the English, inshallah.